Welcome to a series called The End of Times, where we're going through the book of Revelation verse by verse to see what it is we can expect to happen in the end times, or the time Jesus refers to as the end of the age. And I want to really make a very important note at the beginning of this episode, because the next several episodes, we will be talking about the sixth bowl of the wrath of God, most of which in the following verses are going to lead up to Armageddon. And understanding Armageddon is something that most people just simply, they've got it very, very confused. If you were to ask a pastor, what is Armageddon? Chances are they're wrong. Chances are they don't know, but if they do know, they're probably wrong. Because what they're going to say is something to the effect of, well, it's the final battle. It's not the final battle, ladies and gentlemen. The final battle is the battle where Jesus lands on the Mount of Olives, and it's in the Valley of Decision. Armageddon is something that has a lot to do with that, but it's not that. That is not what that is. So I really want to make this important note at the beginning of this episode, because there's going to be a lot of things we're going to be talking about that if you haven't watched episode 48 and 49 specifically, this is going to be fairly confusing to you. And I'm going to do my best to recap, but it's really one of those things that it's just going to be very confusing to you. So, if you haven't seen episode 48 or 49, I guess I'm going to say it. I've never done this with one of these episodes, but I'm going to say stop and go watch it, because it's going to get very deep here, because understanding Armageddon is something that is greatly confused in the world today. And when you finally get it, it's fascinating. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to take this episode and we're just going to kind of talk about these verses that are leading up to Armageddon and what is actually taking place, because the next four verses, they're all over the place. They're literally all over the place. But what we're talking about is we're talking about how Armageddon begins. So we're just going to pick it up where we left off. In Revelation 16, then the sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, so that the way of the kings from the east might be prepared. And I saw three unclean spirits like frogs coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophets. For they are spirits of demons, performing signs which go out to the kings of the earth and of the whole world, to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. Behold, I am coming as a thief. Blessed is he who watches and keeps his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. And they gathered them together to the place called in Hebrew Armageddon. So when I kind of thought about really how to even begin, I'm being honest, I spent about an hour just trying to figure out how do you even begin to talk about this. And a lot of it really is you got to assume, I'm going to make a lot of assumptions that you understand some things that don't need to be said because you've seen episodes 48 and 49. So I'm going to make a lot of assumptions of a knowledge set. If you're watching this, I am going to do my best to recap, but it's going to get pretty deep here pretty quick. So as I kind of thought about, well, where do you begin with this? Where do you begin? Armageddon begins at the river Euphrates. It all begins there, because what is taking place here is, if you ask a pastor, what is Armageddon? Chances are they're wrong. And if you ever ask them, well, what's going on with this river Euphrates? Because ultimately what it's saying here is then the sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, so that the way of the kings from the east might be prepared. Now, I want to remind you here at God, Family, and Guns that we don't make assumptions. We don't use people's commentary. We only use the Bible as a reference. The best commentary to the Bible and the best reference to the Bible is the Bible. So nothing that I'm about to say is going to be because I heard it from that guy or that guy. So a lot of what I'm going to say is probably going to go against what you've heard in the past about Armageddon and about this river Euphrates, because Armageddon begins at the river Euphrates. Now, we're just going to talk about the river Euphrates first. I'm going to give you a little recap as we talk about this, because we've seen this in Revelation before in episodes 47 and 48. There's a lot of assumptions people make about this. A lot. There's the assumption that this river drying up is making the way for China. Okay, that's an assumption. There's nothing in the Bible that says then China did this thing. There's nothing in there. It definitely means one thing, and it possibly means a second thing in addition to that one thing. And the very first thing it means is, again, we're going to go back to when God had prepared 4 angels who are wild, reckless, and obedient for this day. They are prepared for that day, and they've been bound in the river Euphrates. And when he says there's 4 of them, the number is actually 200 million. And because, and we gave this example of when Jesus saw the tormented man on the islands, and he asked him, "What is your name?" And he said, "My name is Legion, for we are many." So we're talking about 4 angels, 4 fallen angels. These are definitely demons who are wild and reckless, but obedient to God. And what I mean by obedient to God was even that angel on the island with Jesus was obedient to him. He begged him, and he was humbled and begged him for things. I mean, he knew who Jesus was right away, and he was immediately humbled and very obedient, even though he was wild and reckless. And here we have 4 angels, or 200 million angels, who are ultimately about to destroy a third of mankind. And we see that in Revelation 12. And stay with me, because again, a lot of people are saying, no, it's making the way to China. Like, just stay with me, or they're wrong, and possibly right, but stick with me, because Armageddon does not begin there. It begins at the river Euphrates, because what's taking place here, and we're just going to jump to Revelation 9:14. Release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. So the 4 angels who had been prepared for the hour and day and month and year were released to kill a third of mankind. Now the number of the army of the horsemen was 200 million, and I heard a number of them, and thus I saw the horses in a vision. Those who sat on them had breastplates of fiery red, hyacinth blue, and sulfur yellow. And the heads of the horses were like the heads of lions, and out of their mouths came fire, smoke, and brimstone. By these 3 plagues a third of mankind was killed, by the fire and the smoke and the brimstone which came out of their mouths. For their power as in their mouth and in their tails, for their tails are like serpents having heads, and with them they do harm. Now, what this is, and again, people make a lot of assumptions. These aren't tanks. These aren't, Chinese people coming from the east. These are spiritual beings who are going to kill a third of mankind the moment they are released from the river Euphrates. And again, go back to episode 48 and 49 to see that. But what's taking place here, if we then go back to the Revelation 16:12, is 6th angel poured out his bowl in the great Euphrates, and its water was dried up, so that the way of the kings from the east might be prepared. This is definitely a spiritual war about to erupt, with 200 million wild angels being very obedient. We could go back to Isaiah, we could go back to Ezekiel, and we see that these things they're almost like an organized army in rows, and they just go and they're just going to kill everything in their path is about to get destroyed. Before them, what the Bible says is green. Behind them, everything is burned up. And the people before them are also in pain, is what the Bible says, because they just got stung by wasps, and now here comes these guys. Now, we know that this is true because, again, go back to Isaiah 11:15, Isaiah 13, 3 through 1, Ezekiel 9, 1 through 5, Ezekiel or Revelation 13, 3 through 5. So I'm not making any assumptions here. It's clearly spelled out in Old Testament what these things are and what they're there to do. They are clearly there to kill anybody in their path that is not marked on the foreheads by God. Anybody in their path that is not marked by God. And it is only God's chosen. It is only his remnant that are marked. And again, we saw that in Ezekiel 9, 1 through 5. So what are these things? Well, what's taking place here is the river Euphrates is dried up. Now that then releases these creatures, which we already saw in Revelation, are these angelic beings, and they destroy a third of mankind. This is obviously not going to go well for the Antichrist and his world army. It's not going to go well. When he starts seeing not only has his kingdom been destroyed, but now that he's in Jerusalem and he's in Israel, he's watching these things destroy things. And they're also going to come into Jerusalem, as we saw in Isaiah. They definitely roll into Jerusalem as well. So this is then, God then puts hooks into the world army, and he pulls them to the hill of Armageddon, because that is where this battle between these 200 million angelic things that are wildly killing everything in their path, and the Antichrist army. But what we're about to see in these future verses is they're also demonic things. The Antichrist and his cronies, they're demonic. They're demonically possessed humans is what they are, because that's why the frogs are coming out of their mouths. That's why we see they are demons. So this battle of Armageddon that we're about to see, it's not the final battle. And that's where people are very wrong. The final battle, it clearly says Jesus comes in a cloud of glory, and his feet land on the Mount of Olives. And then the armies of the world come from Jerusalem, and when they cross towards Mount of Olives in the Valley of Decision, that's where the winepress takes place, and they get pressed, blood everywhere. So we need to be very clear as we get going on kind of this battle of Armageddon, is there's a lot leading up to the battle. Like, a lot of things are going to cause the world to come to the hill of Armageddon, which is what Armageddon stands for, the hill of Armageddon. Not in Jerusalem, it's north, kind of by Lebanon. Now, the thing that they might be right about the Chinese is it does say that he pulls the armies of the world to Armageddon, and that would then make, so they might be right, but they're not coming there to attack Israel, or if the Chinese come, and it doesn't say anything about that, I'm just saying they could possibly be right, because it does say God puts hooks in the armies of the world and pulls them to this hill of Armageddon, and it could be that then makes that way for them to get there. But that's a lot of assumptions in that. So when people say, well, that's definitely China, that it might be, but that's a big assumption. It definitely is a bunch of angels being released. So, if we, and again, I hate to confuse you, and this is a pretty deep conversation that really, again, you got to go back and watch 48 and 49, episodes 48 and 49, because we talk about these angels being released, what's going on. We read those passages from Isaiah, Ezekiel. We read the passages from Jude that talks about this. It's very clearly spelled out what is taking place here. But what is happening here is the river is drying up, and that is releasing those angels, the 200 million that are bound in the river Euphrates, specifically prepared for the day of the Lord, specifically prepared for this time. So, again, the battle of Armageddon is a battle between about 200 million angels and the devil, and a third of the fallen angels. So honestly, those 200 million angels that killed a third of mankind, they're not going to be any match for the Antichrist and his army, because it's the devil and his army is what it really is. They're not going to be any match. So the battle of Armageddon is not the final battle. It's going to end all this battle between the angels that's going to take place on earth, but it's not the final battle. And that's really the big clarity that we have to see going into this, is that, Jesus doesn't come to the hill of Armageddon. He comes to the Mount of Olives. What's taking place at the hill of Armageddon is, near the end, like it's right before Christ is coming. So, it could kind of be a very similar moment in time, being that, the only way I could see it being as close is when they all gather at the hill of Armageddon to kill all these angelic beings. Then Jesus returns and they make their way to Jerusalem. I could see that kind of thing. But it is not the final battle. And you just have to be very clear on that. And even the final battle of the winepress in the Valley of Decision, 1,000 years later, there's even another battle. So make sure that when people are explaining Armageddon, and this episode is mostly to kind of just put the record straight on what, because again, when I started this, I didn't even know where to begin, but it begins at the River Euphrates. The Armageddon begins at the River Euphrates. The river dries up. 200 million angelic beings kill a third of mankind. That makes the armies of the world declare war on them, because up until that point, those angels are the only thing that had any foot to stand on, because we just endured 3.5 years of the Antichrist dominating. And God has them all gather together at the Hill of Magedon, and we're just going there's a lot going on in verses 12 through 16. In these 4 verses or 5 verses, it's going to get really deep, but where does it begin? It begins at the River Euphrates. And again, go back and watch 48 and 49. I guarantee if you go back and you watch it right after this episode, if you didn't do it earlier, you're going to go, oh, now it all makes sense. Because all those verses I kind of threw at you pretty quick, we clearly read them out. Because again, what we're seeing is a spiritual war is going to break out on the earth, not just in heaven, but it is going to break out like crazy, and it's going to start with the River Euphrates drying up, and then all these angelic beings that have been held for that moment, created and held for that moment, are then going to kill a third of mankind. And right in the middle of all that, then all the armies of the world are going to come and meet them at the Hill of Magedon. And that's kind of where we're at on this. So stick with me. There's a lot more going on. I just wanted to make that very clear. But and I also want to reiterate, again, you would have seen this, you went back, but they don't just kill anybody. They just don't kill everybody in their path. It was clearly spelled out in Ezekiel 9, 1 through 5, that right before they show up, one angel with a pen goes and he starts marking everybody. I mean, it goes really quick. I believe, according to about a half hour, it takes him to mark all of humanity that is the remnant of God. And then these angels come in and they kill anybody in their path that is not marked. And that's obviously going to cause a war to take place. When a third of mankind is killed by something that just showed up all of a sudden because the river dried up, that's obviously going to create a worldwide war where people are then going to show up at the Hill of Magedon, and then we'll kind of get deeper into that on the future episodes. So, again, I apologize that this was confusing. I knew it would be. Right when I started, when I kind of was preparing, I thought there's almost no way to have this conversation about what's taking place at the River Euphrates, which does lead to the Battle of Armageddon, without the context of what we've talked about in the past. You specifically have to look at Revelation 9. You specifically have to look at Jude 1:6. You specifically have to look at Mark 5, 2 Kings 19:35, Isaiah 11:15, Isaiah 13:3, and Ezekiel 9, 1 through 5, and Revelation 13, 3 through 5. All those, when we talk about those, all those have everything to do with this River Euphrates. So, again, I'm doing my best. I apologize, because you have to see those other episodes to fully understand that. So just to simplify it, what is taking place is when that 6th bowl is poured out, the River Euphrates is dried up. At some point, when you hear a trumpet blast, 200 million angelic creatures who have been created for that time and that day are going to be released. And then they're going to kill a third of mankind that is not marked by God. And, to understand what that means to be marked by God, we're not talking about being marked by the Antichrist on the forehead. We're talking about being marked by God on the forehead. In Ezekiel 9, 1 through 5, we see the moment where these angels are about to kill show up, and some of them have battle axes. And they're told to stop and wait till everybody's marked. And then another angel with a fountain pen comes in, and he, in about 30 minutes, marks all of mankind who is the remnant of God. And then anybody in that path that is not marked is going to get killed. And that is not going to go well for the Antichrist. Because, again, the Antichrist's army is not just people, because what we're about to see is they're demons. They are literally demons. That's why there's frogs coming out of their mouths. They are demons. And these 200 million wild, crazy, angelic creatures that are about to kill a third of mankind, they are no match to Satan and a third of the fallen angel, or a third of all angels that have fallen to the earth. So you have, the countless, like the stars of demons being led by Satan against just 200 million wild angels. They're not going to do well, but this is all leading up to the Battle of Armageddon, and that's, it's real important that you just don't think of the Battle of Armageddon as the final battle, because it's not the final battle. There's also the battle at the Valley of Decision, and then even if that's not the last one, 1,000 years later, there's another battle. 1,000 years after Christ had even been reigning for 1,000 years. So it's not the final battle. It isn't. It leads up to that, and it gives the momentum towards the final battle, but it is definitely not the final battle. So hope this video helps. I apologize it was confusing. Again, if you haven't gone back and watched episode 48 and 49, just go and do it. I guarantee if you did get confused in this episode, you're not going to be confused when you go watch those other episodes. It's going to clearly spell out all those verses that I just kind of threw at you. We go into them in detail. So hope this helps. Stick with us. We're getting to the Battle of Armageddon. It's going to get fascinating. As soon as that's done, we're gonna look at spend a lot of time talking about Babylon and the Scarlet Beast. Fascinating stuff to come. If you like this video, click like and subscribe. Feel called to support this channel through Patreon. That link is also below. But the most important part of this channel is we take prayer requests, so never hesitate to send that in. Thank you for watching this episode of God, Family, and Guns. And as always, love God, love your family, and love guns.